Well, we're still talking end times because here we are in our series of the Gospel of Mark, and we've come to chapter 13 of the Gospel of Mark, which is a end times prophecy prediction kind of chapter. So we're going to take our time and have these sessions build on themselves to take a look through fresh eyes. How does prophecy really work? If I'm just sort of naturally reading scripture and I come across this passage and Jesus says all of these big ticket items, what do I do with that? How do I understand it? How am I supposed to understand it, or at least give me direction so that I can do some study on my own? Hopefully those are some good questions that you're asking. Hi, I'm Pastor Andrew, and I want to say thank you for continuing to join us as we continue through this devotional series of the Gospel of Mark. Really, this one is a teaching series. And again, this builds on itself. So here, this is session 13-4. I really hope that you'll go back and watch 13-1, 2, and 3, because they're building on themselves so that what we're saying here makes sense. And again, we're approaching this conversation through fresh eyes to say, if you come to this naturally, organically, without all of this other knowledge or experience, how do we sift through it? So we know this is called the Olivet Discourse. We know that it's found parallel passages, Matthew 24, here in Mark 13, and in Luke 21. And so Jesus warns his disciples. Let's continue to move right through this passage. So Mark 13, I'm going to spend a little bit more time in Matthew 24 because, again, Matthew gives a little bit more detail to his account, but I'm pulling from all of them. Matthew 24, we read these three perspectives on the Mount of Olives. The next section that we come to is verses 9 to 14. Okay, kind of a bigger section. Verses 9 to 14 in Matthew 24, it's verses 9 to 13 in Mark 13. And it's fascinating because for the disciples specifically, it's really fascinating, yet it's for them specifically is what I mean to say. It's for them specifically, but at the same time, it's for the whole church, which is future from where they're sitting, again, on the Mount of Olives, early 30s AD is the time frame. So during this conversation, what Jesus says is so pointed for the disciples specifically, but it's also future. It's also representative of the church age, so to speak, of what would be happening for the next 2,000 years, because we can look back and say, well, it's been at least 2,000 years or so. So I say that because as we read what Jesus says about them being delivered up into tribulation, this is what Jesus will say. You're going to be delivered up into tribulation. That is, you're going to go to court and you're going to have trials and you're going to be brought before councils and you're going to be persecuted for my name's sake and the sake of the gospel. You're going to be killed for my name's sake and the sake of the gospel. And he says, many will fall away from the faith. There'll be hatred. There'll be division among families because you have a faith in me. Many false prophets will lead people astray. He says lawlessness will increase and the love of people will wax cold is a great version, but the love of people will grow cold. They'll just get tired. It's a sad thing. But he says this in Matthew 24:14. He says, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole inhabited world, earth, as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. It almost seems like a conclusion to the Olivet Discourse and what Jesus is saying, but there's a lot more to come. So you can see it's even not in chronological order as you read through Mark 13 over and over again, Matthew 24, pieces are fit differently. Again, kind of how it works. So we read this story about you're going to be persecuted and there's going to be division, but this gospel is going to be preached. As we continue to read the Bible, we're going to read in the book of Acts, wow, that happened. They were persecuted. They were killed for their faith. The gospel was preached around the known world. And then when the New Testament writing completed, the gospel continued to spread. Man, it's covered the globe. And so we see that happened. But then we can also see, well, the end hasn't come yet. So we know then that a lot of that stuff, if not all of that stuff that Jesus has just said in verses 9 to 14, is applicable to the church. So there will be persecution. And in fact, we see that. So the prophecy is for them specifically in their immediate context, but it's also for the church, for you and for me. And the good news is that the gospel, this message about Jesus is in fact being preached all over the world. That is a fulfillment of a prophecy that Jesus gives in the Olivet Discourse. And even today, unfortunately, persecution is happening around the world. People are losing their lives for their faith in Jesus. but Jesus is being faithful to his promise, and he is faithful to his people. And in this sense, this is our mission. This is kind of a mission call, that to let the whole world know about Jesus, to let the whole world know about his goodness and the goodness of God. And then the end will come. So even in the midst of this Olivet Discourse, when Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple, and he's predicting persecution and famine and earthquakes and wars, and all of these things are going to happen, we also have mission in there, that the end will come, but this gospel has to be preached to everyone in the inhabited earth so that the whole world can know. You get that? There's a little bit of excitement there for a mission, for our job, as our duty as Christian. And then after that account of the story in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus says something that I think is the most intriguing and sort of captivating thing ever as it relates to end times. He uses this phrase, abomination of desolation, and seems to use a past event from his vantage point to describe something that will happen in the future. And in order to appreciate this, we have to understand what happened that Jesus is talking about, and that the disciples completely understood what he was talking about from that point. But is it future from his vantage point? Is it future from our vantage point? What does this mean? What is this curious phrase, abomination of desolation? What even is that? Man, that's the next point. And from that point is where we sort of launch out into, what about a great tribulation and an Antichrist figure and all of these things that maybe you've heard about before? This is where the ship begins to turn as we look a little bit deeper into this concept of the abomination of desolation. Jesus says, when you see this, run. So interesting. We'll dive into that next time. We'll see you then.